Hi, it's Andrea. I'm in ear intensive. So I was thinking about if you could address how physical symptoms show up that probably arrived energetically, and if there's a helpful or useful way to decipher the messages that they're giving us. As far as like real causes.
Right.
Did I ask that in a helpful manner?
So you did? Are you going through some symptoms right now?
Yes. Well, I have a variety of weird symptoms and also common symptoms. So I have like a thyroid issue. I have fibromas on the bottom of my feet. And I'm thinking that the cause of my thyroid is not that I don't take enough thyroid pills, like, you know what I mean? Like, is that the real answer forever? And, you know, kind of what's this other stuff doing in my body? And, you know, how did it get there? How do I get rid of it?
So when you start recalling, you know, go back to the beginning of the intensive where we talked about we aren't a physical body, but rather we're an energy system. And relative to the energy system, tend to be two qualities of energy, that which builds the system up, you know, the energies that belong in a cell, and that which tears them down, the energies that don't belong in the cell. When we lock energies that don't belong in the cell, when we lock them in, then we say the cell is now diseased. We look at it, its structure has changed, its chemistry has changed. We say the cell is diseased. And when you become light enough and you start to do your work and you reverse the flow of that energy, on the way in, the cell experiences symptoms. On the way out, when you start to dig that old energy out and start to move it out of the system, the symptoms are going to be identical. So, and in fact, maybe Jeannie could put in the notes for today, the audio we did. Patrick McGann, who's another naturopath, and I spent about an hour talking about the healing process and healing crisis on a show a little while back. And so in the naturopathic system of things, I recognize that if I put an energy into the system and became symptomatic, when I start digging back that back out and throwing it off, then I'm going to experience some of the same symptoms. It's called the healing crisis. Now, what tends, this is not absolute, but what tends to interfere with the thyroid functioning is anger. That's what tends to get locked in and shut the thyroid down. So if I were doing my work and starting to become more vital and healing, then probably as I take the load off of my thyroid that's been causing it to dysfunction, it's going to look like experiencing some old feelings of anger. Has that been going on for you?
But I haven't been able to identify a trigger as far as working through it on a worksheet. Sometimes it's just like a general aggravation, or it's situational rather than naming a person.
Right. So as you do your work, if you can see that for a time period, or maybe your whole life, maybe your whole genetic history has been about trying to suppress your anger, trying to shut your anger down, and now you're standing in a space of willingness. You've taken the advice of the intensive of, okay, I'm going to move instead of resistance, I'm going to move into willingness, and I start to embrace those things, and that's going to tend to come back. Sometimes it may have thoughts attached to it, and other times what we'll find is that, seeing as how anger is always a cover for pain, underneath it, we're going to start to get in touch with the pain that we haven't been wanting to deal with. And once you start to allow that pain to come forward, it might be physical, it might be mental, it might be emotional. We actually have a chart called the physiological effects of emotional suppression. Maybe Jeannie, she's probably already doing it, we'll put that in the notes too, and you go and download that chart and print it off, and you'll see the kinds of thought disorders that tend to go along with the shutting down of the energies that don't belong in the system. The thyroid being one part of the system that tends to shut down. And so what you want to do is take every tool we've been learning. Like, for instance, if you are touching into some anger and it doesn't seem to be pointed at anyone or anything in particular, I might look at the worksheet we did on the codependence worksheet, where I looked at all the people who've ever, bothered me or upset me, or so I think they've upset me, and then look at what's going on for me around that. What are my punishment thoughts, and just see if it approximates anyone or anything on that list, and that may give you a clue as to more specific work to do. If you can see that, yeah, I kind of had this general, grumpy feeling and irritation, and I just wanted to say to somebody, just get your act together. I might go back and find on that worksheet, oh, here's where I told somebody to get their act together. So I might look and see, is that who I'm processing around? Is that what's moving for me? And, it's a process of building awareness where yesterday it was oblivion. So becoming aware, and the more aware I am, the more I work with the tools, the more I can master the energy that I either hold in my system or that I release it from my system. And so if you see any parallels with that, or you can go back to the 3 early memories exercise and see if what seems sort of non-specific right now, but see if I can tie it in with anything in those 3 early memories, and I'll probably be able to kind of pinpoint what I'm in the process of really moving through and healing. And if I've spent most of my life not wanting to look at that, then it'll take a little practice to get to decode those things as they start to move.
Okay.
And willingness and breathing are 2 of the big keys.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Does that fit and make sense? All right. And give a listen to that radio show.
I was looking to get into that homework anyway. I just kind of was wondering if there's I like to look at things from a couple different angles, right? Like, I'm trying to build the brain cells now. So if I watch videos about it or hear about it or come from the body or come from the homework, I'm kind of just, trying to move it all along.
Right. And you tend, if you download and print that chart on the physiological effects of emotional suppression, you'll see that for most of us, we started out in, if you look at the newborn child and the young child, they come back in enthusiasm over and over and over again. That's just where they live. And if you break down that word enthusiasm in theos, it literally means in God, in love, connected to love. And that's where we all started out. But then, we've been talking about the power person. If the power person starts giving messages to somebody of, well, you're no good, you're not worthy, you don't deserve my attention, why don't you get out of my way? Then those thought disorders the child tends to take in, especially under stress with the power person, and the thought disorders usually start out, the one that takes most people out of enthusiasm, out of that real aliveness and joie de vivre, tends to be a thought like, there's something wrong with me, I'm broken. And when that happens and we disconnect from that presence of love, and then oftentimes the pain is not allowed. The power person's been shutting down and suppressing their pain all their lives. So if the child exhibits any pain, it's like, shut up, or, you ever hear this line, I'll give you something to cry for? I can remember being fed that line as a kid. It was like, excuse me, I've already got something to cry for. That's why I'm crying. But the power person, I'll give you something to cry for. And then the thought disorder there tends to become something like, I'm not even allowed to feel what's real for me. And I'm threatened. So they want to hurt me. And so there's an order to the disordered thoughts that tends to go right through and shut down the pineal gland, the pituitary gland, the thyroid, the thymus, just go right down the line and shut it down. And as you reawaken those parts, up come the sensations that go with it, the feelings that came with those thoughts, the awareness or the cognizance of the thought disorders and the healing of them. And that takes the load off of the system. So it's kind of reversing the process. They call it aging, but it really has nothing whatsoever to do with time. If it starts out in a small child and by the time they're 30, they're well locked into hostility and fear, it looks like it was the 30 years that did it, but it wasn't the 30 years that created that aging process or that disease process. It was the energies that weren't being consciously, purposely dealt with that were locked into tissue that began the disintegration of tissue. Lifted back out of the tissue, and the tissue is happy to go back to its normal, healthy state. That's what it's designed to do.
Very cool.
We're designed to be self-healing mechanisms. But if we burden and burden and burden and burden, we spend our whole lives burdening the system, and nobody ever gives us the tool for unburdening ourselves. And like, who ever heard outside of this work that forgiveness is about unburdening yourself, about taking out of your structure, literally, the energies of hostility and fear that never belonged there. It's nothing, if I'm burdened with hostility or fear and somebody's in my face and I say, oh, it's okay, I forgive you, I let you off the hook for what's moving inside of me, I haven't done anything to change what's moving inside of me, so I'm going to tend to continue the disintegration process. When I reverse that and go, oh, so forgiveness is how I touch into what's burdening my cellular structure, and I alleviate myself of that burden. So it's like building a whole new set of brain cells and turning the wagon around and going the other way, and then you realize it's got nothing to do with time or age. There's no such thing as aging. And when I start to remove what never belonged, when I become conscious of it and acquire the skills and the tools of removing what never belonged, then I start youthing instead of aging, reversing the whole process. That's what we're here to do.
Pretty cool. Okay, thank you very much
cool.
for.
It's
super
absolutely
cool.
Delighted. It is. It's awesome. I mean, I can go back. I started my life out, and the night I was being born, they called my father at work and said, "If you want to see this kid alive, you better get down here because you're not going to live through the night." And I lived on inhalator and pills for 25 years. I haven't had a drug in my body for decades and decades. But for 25 years, every miracle drug, and that's what really inspired me to start doing this work, because while the drugs they were giving me kept me alive, I realized they were killing me. They weren't making me more vital. They weren't working through anything. It just was, I could see, was a downhill run. Oh, well, that one stopped working. Well, we'll give you this one. Oh, you need a stronger inhaler? Okay, well, here's your new prescription for your new inhaler. I haven't used an inhaler in 50 years. It's like, it's crazy time. And there is, of course, a place for treatment. That type of thing is called treatment. There's a place for treatment. Treatment can save a life. It just can't heal anything. And so what we need to be doing when we're, being treated for something is we need to be educated in what the skills are and the tools are for moving out what never belonged. And that's the core of Yeshua, is forgiveness, removal. So it's pretty sweet. And delighted to have you calling.
Okay,
Any other
thank you
thoughts?
very much.
Go for it, Jean.
Go ahead, Andrea. I'll go after you.
Oh, no, I'm good. That's plenty to chew on. Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
Well, I put the notes that for the or the links for the symptoms of healing and for the 2 radio shows for the healing crisis and physiological effects. All of that is both in the notes for today, and also I put it under the codependence group. And then one other thing to add to it, if you've never looked at it, Louise Hay is pretty well on target. And if you look up, and I put the link for that in there too, and she says thyroid issues is humiliation. I never get to do what I want to do. When is it going to be my turn? And hyperthyroid, she says, is rage, especially at being left out. So that goes along with also exactly what Michael had just said. So
right. Yeah. Thank you. I do have that book, and I have that book. And I have the Body Never Lies. I've looked at some of that as far as, I don't know if you guys. I'll look at the other information you posted. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Cool. You're welcome. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, it's perfect. There's another book out there that has been out of print, I don't know how long. It's been out of print for decades. But back in my early days of doing this work in Atlanta, there was a little lady who was in her, I forget if she was in her late 70s or early 80s, and we actually co-taught. We did some workshops together. Her name was Alice Stedman, and she was from a medical family. But she decided not to go the medical doctor route. She decided to go the healer route and became a healer. And the name of her book, and I've found it, I bought a couple of copies of it over the years on Amazon or on eBay, is Who's the Matter with Me? And she was just this sweet fireball of a woman that, she just didn't take any nonsense from anybody, and she was just right there with, if I'm in a disease state, if somebody's in a disease state, you got to start looking at who you're pointing your hostility or fear at and clean it up. So you might check out Who's the Matter with Me if you can find it. It was like, I think the last time I bought a copy, it was $2 or $3 on Amazon.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, she was a sweetie. All right, young lady, thanks for the questions.
Okay, you're welcome. Bye, thank you.
All right, perfect start. How cool is that? So the foundation of everything that I've just said is, in Einstein's words, when he says, on such things as matter, we have been all wrong. What we have heretofore called matter is energy whose vibrations have been so lowered as to be perceptible to the senses. There is no matter. Einstein says matter doesn't exist. Can you possibly have a diseased body? No, you cannot. Well, Michael, that's ridiculous. What do you mean I can't have a diseased body? Because there's no such thing as a body. A body is nothing but a construct in the mind. It's a picture generated by the mind. What's really there, if you could alter the rate of vibration at which your so-called I sees, takes in information, you'd see this whirring mass of electrons, protons, and neutrons. You would not see a body. Max Planck, this goes back around 1900. He's receiving the Nobel Prize in Physics. And as part of his acceptance speech, here's what he said. He said, as a man who spent his entire life studying matter, I can tell you this much. There is no matter as such. Our entire world, he says, is made up of succeedingly smaller patterns of vibratory fields, nested one within another, within another. If you're in a diseased state, the question to ask yourself is not, what are these bugs doing to my body? The question to ask yourself is, what is it that I've nested in my structure that causes my energy field to deteriorate to the point where I attract a thing called a reducer organism? Reducer organisms, probably the easiest example to think of is the lion out in the savannah. Now, the lion in the savannah doesn't go looking for the biggest, toughest bull water buffalo to take down. Water buffaloes will kill a lion. The lion is a reducer organism. If there's a weak, injured water buffalo, that's what the lion will call from the herd and take down and have for lunch. If there are weak cells, because there are energies that have been locked into the cells that cause their deterioration, then that spontaneously gives rise to a cleanup crew, reducer organisms. The problem isn't the bacteria or the virus. The problem is that we've got weakened cells like the injured water buffalo, the weakened water buffalo, and those organisms are designed to call the herd and clean it up. You know, imagine that we've got a 1-acre field out here in the house, and in front of the house. And, you know, here it is, a nice warm day in Bristol, Virginia. It's actually about 75 right now, really very pretty. But let's imagine it's 98.6. And we have a 1-acre field out here. And I go out and I rope off 1 square foot of that acre here in this corner, and then I go to the very opposite corner and I rope off another square foot, and I now start to do a survey. I'm going to count how many bugs and buzzards and flies and fleas and creepy crawly things there are on each square foot. You're probably going to be pretty much the same. But if it's 98.6 degrees and I put a dead rabbit inside that little 1 square foot roped off area, and I leave it for a couple of days and come back, I'm going to find an elevated count of all of those creepy things, right? The bugs, the buzzards, the flies, the fleas, the creepy crawlies. I'm going to find an elevated count. Where am I going to find the elevated count? 100% of the time, the elevated count is going to be where the dead decaying tissue is. The dead decaying tissue, the creation has in it, by design, what's called reducer organisms. When something's dying, there's a critter that's designed to take it out. Now, unfortunately, in treatment, what most do is they further toxify the tissue. They try to poison what seems to be the invader. The invader couldn't be there in healthy tissue. The tissue, if something's been nested of a disintegrative nature, is going to be weakened and start to fall apart and become a breeding ground, just like that dead rabbit is. So if you add poison to the already weakened tissue, what happens? Well, you're going to need a stronger poison in a very short period of time, and still a stronger one. You know, they talk about the blessing of antibiotics, and it has been amazing. I mean, things that people died of, those antibiotics have done miraculous things. But if you read some of the reports of the people who study antibiotics, guess what they're telling us? They're telling us that by 2050, more people will be dying of antibiotic-resistant organisms than today are dying from cancer, the #1 killer. And because that mindset that produces the antibiotic thinks that the problem is the bug, they have an answer. I mean, literally, go read the reports that are talking about 2050, the massive amounts of deaths are going to happen as a result of antibiotic-resistant bugs. You look at the number of people that die today of them. And guess what they're telling us? All we need to do is develop a stronger antibiotic. Just give us more money so we can do more research and we'll get a stronger one. Well, guess what a stronger one's going to do? It's going to create a still more virulent antibiotic-resistant bug that's going to kill more people. And, you know, since the advent of antibiotics, which isn't that many decades ago, yes, it's saved many lives. But unfortunately, it's never healed anybody. If the person we give the antibiotic to was handed healing tools and it was explained what was going on, then we'd have treatment and healing. And we wouldn't be concerned about the antibiotic-resistant bugs because we wouldn't be trying to develop more and more and more virulent ones. And people would wake up and realize that 70% in America, 70% of antibiotics are used for what? Does anybody know? They're used for forced growth of feed animals, cows and chickens and ducks and whatever. 70% of the antibiotic use, which creates antibiotic-resistant organisms, is used on farms to force growth. Nothing to do with the health of the animals. In fact, it deteriorates the health of the animals, but it forces growth. And you know what? That's still allowed. Even though we know what's happening with antibiotic-resistant organisms, well, you know, there's a big money thing. I mean, when you think of 70% of the antibiotics, how many billions of dollars do you suppose is being fed into big pharma's pocket in order to fatten up cows that you're then going, if you're a cow eater, you're then going to eat that stuff with those chemicals in it, with those energetic patterns? time. If we had anything like integrity in our political system, tomorrow, feeding antibiotics to animals would be stopped in a heartbeat. And the use of antibiotics would be scaled back. You know, people take a little kid to the doctor, and the first thing the doctor does is say, "Oh, here, I've got a pill for you." No, 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 stop, stop. Recognize that if the child has something going on that appears to be a disease process, we need to be looking at what they eat and what kind of mental, physical, and emotional environment they're in, and start cleaning it up and creating healing. And so I'm not saying don't ever use a drug, because there's no question. Absolutely, lives are saved by them. But you'll notice that once you start down that path, you're on one today, a year later you're on 2, 2 years later you're on 4, 4 years later you're on 8, and we were doing an intensive back, this is 10 years ago in Florida. And there was a young man who was former military, who'd been discharged because of health reasons. And when we talked about this idea in the class, he went back into his room and came out with a Walmart-style bag, like a Walmart plastic bag, and it was filled to the brim with all the prescriptions he was taking. He dumped them out on the table. And I don't even remember what the number was. 6 months later, he was down to taking 1 pill, and that was it. And he went from suicidal, alcohol, finding himself hanging from the end of a rope that he'd put around his own neck, and not being able to marry his sweetheart because they had tried living together, and he had so much PTSD that he would wake up in the night choking her to death. He picked up the tools, started doing his work. They now live and cohabit happily and joyfully together. It's what we're here for. And so we need to put together the treatment model with the healing model, and we're going to see massive changes happen in our culture and in our world. And of course, one of the major keys in changing this whole game is cosmic grease, and that's what I like to call willingness. Am I willing to embrace these nested frequencies that may be many generations old, as they perhaps have permeated generation after generation after generation in my bloodline? In fact, they noticed that many dis-ease-type processes skip a generation before it comes back into expression again. And all that's coming into expression when that happens are the dis-ease energies that have not been forgiven within the generations, and we need to wake up and start to be able to decode that information and remove it from our structure. And we're here to help every mind, heart, and being on the planet understand that process, engage in the tools, and let's shift this whole game. Let's turn this around and make this a place where human life thrives, where, the leaders of our country talk lovingly, gently, respectfully to each other and function like human beings. What a radical idea. It's interesting, there were 2 gentlemen back several years ago who started a thing called the Civility Project. And they went to Congress, 535 members of Congress, and the governors of the 50 states. So 585 men and women who were our quote-unquote leaders. And they invited them to sign a pledge. And the pledge that they suggested that each of them sign was the pledge to be civil with each other. They asked 585 so-called leaders to pledge civility in their political intercourse. Guess how many politicos, and this goes back, I'm not even sure, 7, 10, 12 years ago, whatever it was, guess how many out of 585 of them stood up and said, yes, I'll sign a civility pledge? 2 of them. That was it. Now you look at what's being modeled in that system for our children, And it's a travesty and a tragedy because children learn what they live. They take the modeling and they pass it on. And if we're supporting people who are in that kind of vile and vicious temperament and mindset, it's time for us to start to look at our own vile and vicious temperament that allows us to resonate with that and choose to support it and start to clean it up and start to move into a place where we actually truly function as human beings. That's really the bottom line of what this work is about. And so hopefully that discussion makes sense. And if it doesn't, I'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts? Got any questions for me? Is there anything that you're processing?